All right, so this U.S.-India energy deal,
Yeah.
right? It's everywhere you look.
Mm-hmm.
Big headlines, billions of dollars. But what's it actually like mean, for like the average person?
Mm.
Today, we're going to like dive deep into these agreements. And trust me, it's way more interesting than just, oil tankers and pipelines.
Yeah.
We've got this article from the Indian Express, hot off the press, from February 14th, 2025. And we're going to unpack what's really going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. What's really fascinating here is that this isn't just like some random handshake or whatever. It really reflects a major shift in like the whole global energy landscape.
Yeah.
And understanding that context, I think, is key to seeing why this actually matters, even if you're, miles and miles away from either country.
Exactly. So let's set the stage a little bit. I mean, everyone knows India needs a ton of energy, right?
Right.
But here's the catch. Their demand, it's not just because they're a big country. They're going through this crazy period of industrialization. Their population is booming. Millions are moving into the middle class. And all of that needs energy to fuel it.
And that's where that 85% import figure gets really alarming.
Right.
I mean, imagine relying on other countries for over 85% of your energy.
Yeah.
It's like building a house on someone else's land.
Totally.
You're vulnerable to their whims, their price hikes.
Yeah.
This deal could be India's way of like securing a more stable foundation,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So enter Trump and his like grand announcement after meeting with Modi.
Right.
The U.S. wants to be India's TOP energy supplier. Now, I'm no political expert.
Sure.
But there's got to be more to this than just like friendly cooperation, right?
Yeah.
What's the real motivation for the U.S. here?
Well, on the surface, it's about reducing the U.S. trade deficit with India.
Okay.
Basically, the U.S. imports more stuff from India than it exports back to them,
Right.
which isn't ideal economically.
Sure.
So by selling India tons of oil and gas, they can kind of balance the scales a bit,
Ah. So it's like evening out a lopsided shopping spree.
Exactly.
But I have a feeling there's like a deeper game at play here too, right?
Oh, yeah. There's definitely a geopolitical angle as well. The U.S. is vying for influence in the Indo-Pacific region, where China is also a major player, of course.
Yeah.
So by strengthening ties with India through this energy deal, the U.S. gains a strategic ally in the region.
So it's like a game of energy chess,
Kinda.
but with real-world consequences.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be checkmated when it comes to their energy supply.
Exactly. And don't forget that the U.S. is also looking to increase its own global influence in the energy market, potentially at the expense of rivals like Russia.
Oh?
Russia is currently one of India's top oil suppliers.
Right.
So this deal could disrupt that relationship and really shift the balance of power.
Wow. Okay, so we've got the U.S. aiming to boost its economy, strengthen its geopolitical standing, and maybe even edge out some rivals in the process. What about India, though?
Yeah.
What's in it for them besides just getting more energy?
Well, for India, it's all about mitigating risk.
Okay.
Relying so heavily on a handful of suppliers makes them extremely vulnerable to price fluctuations and even supply disruptions. Remember those crazy gas prices a few years back?
Ugh, don't remind me.
This deal could really help cushion India from those kinds of shocks.
Right. Diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, even if it's a big oil-filled basket.
Exactly.
But the article also hinted that this could actually lead to lower oil prices for India. How does that work?
Well, it all comes down to supply and demand.
Huh?
The U.S. is currently pushing to increase its own oil and gas production, thanks to Trump's drill baby drill policy.
Right.
And more supply in the market generally means downward pressure on prices.
So it's like a sale at the energy supermarket. More items on the shelves means better deals for shoppers.
Essentially, yes. And lower energy prices would be huge for India. It impacts everything from their trade deficit, which we can think of as like their national credit card balance, to their currency exchange rates. It even trickles down to everyday expenses like groceries and transportation.
Wow. So this isn't just a deal happening over there. It could potentially like ripple out and affect prices here too.
It's possible.
It's wild. But before we get carried away by like cheap gas fantasies, let's address the elephant in the room here.
Okay.
We're talking about a lot more fossil fuels being produced and burned. What does that mean for the environment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The article did touch on the fact that natural gas, which is part of this deal, is a cleaner burning fuel than coal, which India currently relies heavily on.
Okay, so maybe a slight improvement there. But isn't any increase in fossil fuel production kind of bad news in the long run? I mean, we're talking about climate change, emissions, all those big scary things.
You're absolutely right. Even if there are some short-term benefits in terms of emissions, this deal is essentially locking India into a fossil fuel-based energy system.
Right.
And that's a risky bet in a world that's increasingly focused on renewables and decarbonization.
So it's like a double-edged sword. Short-term economic gains for both countries, but potentially at the cost of long-term environmental sustainability.
Exactly. And it raises some tough questions. Can India really afford to ignore the global push for clean energy? Will this deal hinder their efforts to transition to renewables? These are the kind of dilemmas we need to unpack to understand the true impact of this agreement,
For sure.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we're seeing a case study play out in real time, how intertwined energy and politics and economics all are, you know?
Totally. And this deal with India is a perfect example of that. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the big picture implications, but what about the actual stuff that's changing hands here? Is it mostly crude oil, or is natural gas part of the equation too?
That's a great question, and it highlights a crucial aspect of this deal. The article specifically mentions both crude oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG for short.
Okay.
Now, LNG is kind of a game changer for countries like India that are heavily reliant on energy imports.
I'm all ears. Why is that? What makes LNG so special?
Well, for starters, it's much cleaner than coal, which is a big deal for a country grappling with, pollution concerns. But it's also way easier to transport than traditional natural gas. You can ship it across oceans in these specialized tankers, making it a much more flexible energy source.
Wow. So LNG is like the compact, travel-friendly version of natural gas?
Exactly.
Makes sense why India would be interested,
Yeah.
especially since they're investing heavily in LNG infrastructure, like those
Yeah.
massive import terminals and pipelines.
It's exactly. And that's another piece of the puzzle here. This deal isn't just like a quick buy and sell transaction. It's likely to spur long-term investments in infrastructure development on both sides. The U.S. needs to increase its export capacity, and India needs to build more facilities to handle all that incoming LNG. We're talking about a whole new ecosystem being created here.
Wow. So it's not just about the immediate energy transfer, it's about setting the stage for a long-term energy partnership.
Right.
Speaking of long-term, it's worth pointing out that this deal isn't coming out of nowhere. India already buys a decent chunk of energy from the U.S., right?
You're right. The U.S. is already their fifth largest oil supplier. But there's definitely room for growth. That $15 billion in energy purchases from last year, the article suggests that could jump to a whopping $25 billion annually.
That's a huge EE leap.
Yeah, it's not jump change.
And it reminds me of something India's petroleum minister said last month, that they're basically in the market for oil and willing to buy from whoever can supply. It sounds like they're playing the field, not just putting all their eggs in the U.S. basket.
That's a smart strategy. Diversification is key to energy security. But remember, this deal isn't just about quantity. It's about price, too. And here's where it gets really interesting. Remember Trump's drill baby drill policy?
Oh, yeah?
That push for increased U.S. oil and gas production?
Yeah.
That could actually lead to lower global oil prices.
Now, that's what I call a plot twist. So more drilling could actually mean cheaper gas for everyone, including India.
It's possible.
Tell me more. How does that impact the average person on the street?
Let's break it down. Imagine you're in India, where the cost of fuel affects everything, from transportation to the price of groceries.
Right.
Lower oil prices would be a massive relief, putting more money in people's pockets, easing the strain on household budgets.
Like a domino effect, right? Lower oil prices translate to lower costs for businesses, which can then offer goods and services at more affordable prices. It's a win for consumers and for the overall economy.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the impact on inflation. High energy costs often drive up the price of everything else. Lower oil prices can help keep inflation in check, which is crucial for maintaining a healthy economy.
So for India, this deal isn't just about keeping the lights on. It's about boosting their entire economy and improving people's lives. That's a powerful message.
It is. It's a perfect example of how energy policy can have far-reaching consequences, touching everything from national budgets to the price of bread at the local market.
But let's not forget the other side of the coin here. We can't talk about increased oil and gas production without addressing the environmental impact. The article mentioned natural gas being cleaner than coal. But is that really enough to offset the concerns about climate change?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's where things get complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel than coal, so there's a potential for some short-term emissions reductions. But it's still a fossil fuel at the end of the day. And burning any fossil fuel releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change.
So it's like taking a step forward and then a half step back.
Yeah,
We're making a trade-off between immediate economic benefits and the long-term health of the planet.
precisely.
Yeah.
And that's the dilemma facing India and the entire world, really.
Yeah.
Can we afford to keep relying on fossil fuels, even if it means jeopardizing our future?
It's a tough question.
Huh.
And it brings us back to those winners and losers we talked about earlier. This deal seems to present both opportunities and risks for everyone involved.
Absolutely. It's not a simple equation. And understanding those nuances is crucial if we want to move beyond the headlines and really grasp the real impact of this agreement.
Okay, so let's dive into that complexity a bit. Who are the potential winners in this scenario?
Well, on the surface, both India and the U.S. seem poised to reap some significant benefits.
Yep.
For the U.S., this is a chance to reduce their trade deficit, with India boosting their economy, creating jobs in the energy sector. It also strengthens their geopolitical position in a region where China is trying to, assert its dominance.
So it's a strategic win-win for the U.S. But what about the potential downsides? Are there any hidden costs or risks they might be overlooking?
There are always risks. One major concern for the U.S. is the potential backlash from environmental groups.
Right.
Increased oil and gas production runs counter to global efforts to reduce carbon emissions. So this deal could damage the U.S.'s reputation on climate action, potentially hurting their standing on the world stage.
It's like a balancing act between short-term economic gains and long-term environmental responsibility. It's a tough call for sure. But what about India? What are their main takeaways from this deal?
For India, the potential benefits are huge. They get access to a reliable and potentially cheaper source of energy, which is crucial for a rapidly growing economy like theirs. It also helps them diversify their energy portfolio, reducing their dependence on those traditional suppliers in the Middle East.
So it's about securing their energy future.
Yeah.
And reducing their vulnerability to those global market fluctuations. That makes sense. But are there any potential downsides for India?
There are always trade-offs. One potential risk for India is becoming too reliant on the U.S. for their energy needs. What happens if future U.S. administrations change their policies? Or if relations between the two countries sour? It's important for India to maintain its energy independence and avoid putting all its eggs in one basket.
Okay, so it's about finding that sweet spot between strategic partnerships and maintaining their own autonomy. But let's not forget about the other players in this energy game. How might this deal impact countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, who are currently major energy suppliers to India?
That's a great point. This deal could really shake things up for them. They might feel pressured to offer India better deals to maintain their market share, which could lead to lower prices for consumers.
Okay.
But it could also create tensions and uncertainties in the global energy market.
So it's like throwing a stone into a pond and watching the ripples spread outward. This deal has the potential to affect not just India and the U.S., but the entire global energy landscape.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look beyond the headlines and understand the complex web of relationships and interests at play.
Well said. This deal is a prime example of how energy is about much more than just barrels of oil and pipelines. It's about economics, politics, global power dynamics, and even the future of our planet. It's wild how, one deal can have so many moving parts.
Right. We've talked about the U.S., India, Russia. But what about the big kahuna of the global oil market, OPEC? The article mentioned them briefly, but I feel like there's a whole other layer of complexity there.
Oh yeah, OPEC. They're like the wise old owl of the energy world. Always watching, always calculating. This deal between India and the U.S. could definitely ruffle some feathers in their nest.
So how might they react? Are we talking like price wars, production cuts,
Yeah.
or something even crazier?
It's hard to say for sure, because OPEC isn't like a single entity. It's a group of countries with their own agendas, and sometimes even conflicting interests.
Right.
So some members might see this U.S.-India deal as a direct threat and push for aggressive action, while others might take a more wait-and-see approach.
Okay, so there could be internal disagreements within OPEC about how to respond.
Exactly.
That makes things even more unpredictable. Imagine a family trying to decide where to go on vacation. Everyone has their own opinion. OPEC has to balance the interests of all its members, while also trying to anticipate the moves of these major players like the U.S. and India.
It's like a high-stakes poker game with everyone trying to outsmart each other. But at the end of the day, they all want the same thing, to keep the oil flowing and the profits rolling in.
Right. And that's where things get interesting for consumers like you and me. If OPEC decides to increase production to compete with the U.S., that could lead to lower oil prices globally. But if they decide to cut production to try and drive prices up, well, get ready for some pain at the pump.
Oh man, I don't want to think about that.
Yeah.
So the impact of this deal could reach way beyond India and the U.S. It could potentially influence oil prices for the entire world. That's why it's so important to understand these global connections.
Absolutely. And speaking of global connections, the article mentioned something pretty interesting, a prediction from S&P Global Commodity Insights that this deal could actually open the door for even more U.S. energy exports to Asia.
Hmm. So India is just the beginning. Is the U.S. aiming to become the energy powerhouse of Asia?
It's definitely a possibility. The U.S. is ramping up its oil and gas production, and they need to find buyers for all that energy. Asia, with its booming economies and growing energy demands, is a natural market.
It makes sense from a business perspective, but I can't help but wonder what this means for countries like Russia, who have been, getting pretty cozy with India as an energy partner.
Right, that's a key point. Russia has been one of India's top oil suppliers, and they've been working hard to strengthen those ties. This U.S.-India deal could definitely throw a wrench in their plans.
So is this like a potential geopolitical rivalry brewing over energy resources?
You could say that Russia might see this deal as a direct threat to their interests and try to undermine it. They could offer India sweetheart deals on oil and gas, or they could try to flex their muscles in other ways to discourage India from getting too close to the U.S.
So this energy deal could have some serious ripple effects on the global political landscape too. It's amazing how energy is so intertwined with geopolitics.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how energy is often a tool of diplomacy and influence. Countries use their energy resources to build alliances, exert pressure, and really shape the global balance of power.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the economics of oil prices to the politics of global power dynamics. But let's zoom out for a minute and think about the big picture. What does this deal tell us about the future of energy?
I think it points to a more complex and multipolar energy world. The days of OPEC calling all the shots are fading. The U.S. is emerging as a major energy exporter, and countries like India are becoming much more assertive in pursuing their own energy interests.
So it's a more diverse and competitive energy landscape,
Yeah.
which could be good for consumers in the long run, right?
Potentially, yes. More competition often leads to lower prices, more innovation, but it also means more uncertainty and volatility. It's a very dynamic situation that requires constant monitoring and adaptation.
So no easy answers, just a constantly evolving energy chessboard. But before we wrap up, let's bring it back to our listener for a second. Why should they care about all of this? How does an energy deal between India and the U.S. affect their everyday lives?
That's the key question. Even if you're not directly involved in the energy industry, this deal can still impact you. Global oil prices affect everyone who drives a car, heats their home, or buys anything that's transported using fossil fuels. And the geopolitical shifts we've been discussing could have ripple effects on global security trade, even the price of imported goods.
So it's about staying informed and understanding how these global events can influence our lives, even if it's not always obvious at first glance.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots and
Yeah.
seeing the bigger picture. And sometimes it's about asking tough questions and challenging our own assumptions.
Speaking of tough questions, before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked a lot about the economic and political implications of this deal, but what about the ethical considerations? Is it right for the U.S. to ramp up fossil fuel production when we know the risks of climate change? Is it fair for India to prioritize its economic growth over global environmental concerns? These are complex questions with no easy answers.
Yeah, those are the questions we all need to be grappling with. As we navigate this complex 21st century energy landscape, there are no simple solutions, and every choice we make has trade-offs and consequences.
It's a good reminder that we all had a role to play in shaping the future of energy. We can stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and advocate for policies that align with our values.
Well said. And remember, even small actions can make a difference. Every time we choose to conserve energy, support renewable energy sources, or hold our leaders accountable for their environmental policies, we're contributing to a more sustainable future.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the U.S.-India energy deal. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
And to our listeners, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring the world with us. Until next time.